The camera fades on a wide, desolate stretch of desert. Wind presses against the dry earth, whispering through sagebrush. Somewhere near Albuquerque, New Mexico, the sand is about to give up a secret it kept for far too long. On February 2nd, 2009, a woman walking her dog stumbled upon what looked like a human bone, half buried in the dusty ground on Albuquerque's West Mesa. At first, she thought it might have been a large animal, but as she looked closer, she realized this was no animal. What began as a simple afternoon walk would unravel into one of the darkest and most disturbing mysteries in modern American history. Over the next weeks, police would uncover 11 bodies, women, and one unborn child, scattered across an area roughly the size of 92 football fields. Who buried them? Why here? And how could something so horrific happen in plain sight without anyone noticing? This is the West Mesa Bone Collector, an unsolved case that left scars across Albuquerque and questions that still echo through the desert. If you're new here and you find yourself drawn to the real stories that still haunt the edges of American crime, take a moment to subscribe. It helps us continue exploring the stories that deserve to be remembered and the victims who deserve to be heard. The story begins on a Monday afternoon in early February 2009. The wind was calm and the horizon seemed endless, the kind of dry, open terrain that stretches beyond the eye's reach. A woman named Christine Ross was walking her dog, Ruka, near 118th Street and Dennis Chavez Boulevard, an undeveloped area on the far southwest side of Albuquerque. Christine had walked this route before. It was quiet, isolated, the kind of place where the city's noise felt miles away. But that afternoon, something caught her eye, a white object poking out of the dirt. She thought maybe it was a fossil or a piece of trash. But Ruka kept sniffing at it, persistent. When she bent closer, she saw what looked like a bone, long, weathered, too smooth to belong to an animal. Christine took a photo and sent it to her sister, a nurse. Her sister replied almost immediately, "Call the police." By the time investigators arrived, the sun was already low. Detectives taped off the area, scanning the sandy soil, unsure what they'd find. Within hours, it became clear this wasn't a single grave. It was a burial ground. Over the next month, the Albuquerque Police Department turned the West Mesa into a massive excavation site. Officers, cadaver dogs, forensic teams. They combed every inch of dirt, marking small flags for each new discovery. Every day brought another revelation and another tragedy. One by one, skeletal remains emerged. The final count, 11 women and one unborn child, all buried in shallow graves, all missing for years. But who were they? Police began identifying the victims through DNA and dental records. The names that surfaced painted a heartbreaking pattern. All of the women were young, between 15 and 32 years old. Most were Latina. Many had struggled with addiction, poverty, or life on the streets. And several had been involved in sex work along Albuquerque's East Central Avenue, an area long known for prostitution and drug activity. For the city's detectives, this wasn't just a murder scene. It was a map of forgotten lives. The victims included Jamie Barella, 15, Evelyn Salazar, 27, Veronica Romero, 27, Victoria Chavez, 26, Cinnamon Elks, 32, Michelle Valdez, 22, who was pregnant, Valerie Pacheco, 23, Julie Nieto, 23, Virginia Cloven, 24, Cylon Hill, 15, Monica Candelaria, 22. Each name told a story of a family still searching, a police report filed years earlier, a photograph tucked in a wallet, waiting for closure. But now, the city was forced to confront a chilling truth. Someone had been killing women for years and burying them in plain sight, just miles from neighborhoods, shopping centers, and a major road. As detectives cross-referenced missing persons reports, they noticed something unsettling. The disappearances weren't random. Most of the victims vanished between 2001 and 2005. Then suddenly, it stopped. The killings, it seemed, had ended 4 years before the discovery. Why would a serial killer bury 11 victims in one location, then abruptly stop? Did he die? Move away? Or was he still out there waiting? Detective Ida Lopez, who had been tracking missing women from the city's sex trade for years, recognized many of the names. She kept her own personal list, a binder filled with missing women she feared were connected. Now, her worst fears were confirmed. The West Mesa crime scene quickly became one of the largest homicide investigations in New Mexico history. Over 100 law enforcement officers worked the site. The FBI joined in. Helicopters, ground-penetrating radar, forensic anthropologists. The full weight of modern policing descended on the desert. But for every answer found, 10 more questions emerged. There were no shell casings, no weapons, no clothing fibers that pointed to a suspect. Only the bones, and the quiet silence of a killer who'd planned this for years. Police began with those closest to the victims. Friends, relatives, known associates in the sex trade. But soon, attention turned toward men who'd been linked to similar crimes. One name in particular stood out: Lorenzo Montoya. He lived less than 3 miles from the burial site. He had a long history of soliciting sex workers. And in December 2006, just a few years after the last known West Mesa victim disappeared, he was shot and killed after strangling a woman he had lured to his home. Detectives couldn't ignore the timing. If Montoya was the killer, his death might explain why the murders suddenly stopped after 2006. But there was no direct evidence tying him to the West Mesa graves. No DNA, no confession, no proof he ever visited the site. Just a chilling pattern, and a location he could easily have reached. As weeks turned into months, families gathered near the mesa, leaving flowers and candles in sand. They watched as police trucks came and went, knowing their daughters' final resting places were now behind yellow tape. The desert had given them answers, but not peace. By the time police uncovered the last remains in the West Mesa desert, the question wasn't just who killed these women. It was why no one noticed they were gone. 11 women. Each of them vanished between 2001 and 2005, most from the same neighborhoods, many from the same street corners. And yet, for years, it seemed as if no one had been looking. To understand a West Mesa mystery, we have to go back to Albuquerque at the turn of the millennium, when the city was changing fast and some people were being left behind. Early 2000s Albuquerque was a city split between expansion and decay. New housing developments and shopping centers spread out along the west side, while the East Central Corridor, once part of historic Route 66, was drowning in poverty, addiction, and crime. At night, the neon lights of motels flickered over shadows, sex work, drug deals, desperation. It was a stretch of broken promises. Police patrolled it often. Outreach workers called it dangerous. But for many women who had nowhere else to go, it was survival. Among them were women like Julie Nieto, Veronica Romero, and Cinnamon Elks. All young mothers, all trying to get clean, all disappearing within months of each other. They were known faces in a forgotten place. And then, one by one, they were gone. Detective Ida Lopez had seen their faces before anyone else connected them. For years, she'd been compiling her own informal list, women missing from Albuquerque's sex trade. It wasn't an official task force, just one detective, a wall full of photos, and a gut feeling something was terribly wrong. In her notes, Lopez tracked the details, when they were last seen, who they were with, what part of town they worked. At first, it seemed like individual disappearances, unrelated, tragic, but common in the life of addiction and street work. But as the list grew, a pattern emerged. All the women vanished from the same area. All fit a similar profile. All disappeared without a trace. No calls, no sightings, no arrests afterward. Lopez began to suspect there was a predator at work. But without bodies, there was little she could do. Between 2001 and 2005, families filed missing persons reports again and again. Some were told their daughters were probably on the run. Others were told to wait. For many law enforcement agencies at the time, missing sex workers received less priority, a tragic pattern that repeats across many American cities. For the mothers and sisters of these women, those years were a blur of phone calls, flyers, and hope that never turned into answers. Laura Chavez, mother of 26-year-old Victoria Chavez, remembered standing outside police headquarters, holding her daughter's photo, waiting for someone to listen. They told me she'd come back. They said she probably relapsed, but I knew she was gone. It would take almost a decade for Laura's intuition to be proven right. As more women went missing, the Albuquerque Police Department began facing quiet criticism. Whispers from the community questioned whether enough was being done. To their credit, some detectives, like Lopez, kept digging, but resources were stretched thin. There were no witnesses, no evidence, just names fading from the records. When the remains were finally uncovered on the West Mesa, Lopez's list suddenly became the blueprint of the investigation. Each name she had kept on her wall was now a recovered victim. Her personal theory had become New Mexico's most horrifying reality. Investigators began analyzing maps. They traced the victims' last known locations and travel routes. One eerie discovery stood out. Nearly all of them were last seen within a few blocks of each other, near the intersection of Central Avenue and Wyoming Boulevard. From there, the killer likely drove west, across the Rio Grande, and into the open desert where the city lights faded into darkness. The burial site was hidden, yet accessible. At the time of the murders, it was an empty, undeveloped area near 118th Street. Easy to reach by car, invisible to most passers-by. It wasn't random. It was chosen. Forensic anthropologists studied the remains. Each woman was buried separately, wrapped carefully, sometimes with personal items nearby, but never enough to identify them instantly. None showed signs of gunshot wounds. Some bore signs of strangulation or blunt trauma. Others were too decomposed to tell. Police concluded that the killer had likely transported each victim's body in a vehicle, possibly an SUV or pickup, and buried them one by one over several years. It wasn't sloppy. It was methodical. To move a body, dig a grave, and return home unnoticed. That takes planning. That takes confidence. The killer knew this land and knew the people he was targeting. As the months passed, detectives built profiles, timelines, and theories. Dozens of tips came in, but one clue in particular began to shape the case's direction: satellite imagery. The U.S. Geological Survey, which had been taking aerial photos of Albuquerque's West Mesa since the early 2000s, provided archived images. Analysts noticed something chilling. Between 2003 and 2005, There were visible disturbances in the soil at the exact location where the bodies were later found. Each disturbance corresponded to a single grave. Over time, the disturbed patches faded, slowly reclaimed by the desert wind. This meant the killer had been returning to the same site, over and over, for at least 2 years, burying his victims in a pattern only the earth remembered. News of the West Mesa bone collector spread like wildfire. The term itself was coined by local reporters, and it stuck to the public. The case was terrifying and surreal. To the families, it was confirmation of what they'd feared for years. Vigils were held at the edge of the mesa. Candles, crosses, and photographs lined the dusty ground. Mothers, sisters, and children stood shoulder to shoulder, demanding answers from a system that had ignored them. It was a moment of unity born out of unimaginable grief. The case also exposed a deeper issue: how entire groups of people could vanish without the city noticing. Sex workers, the homeless, people struggling with addiction, often live lives that exist at the edges of society's concern. In Albuquerque, that reality collided with horror. The killer had found a hunting ground among the invisible, a world where victims could vanish quietly and where predators could move without suspicion. These women were not nameless. They were daughters, sisters, mothers. But for years, they lived in a world where their disappearances didn't spark headlines until the desert forced everyone to look. Forensic estimates placed a final burial around 2005. After that, nothing. No new victims matching the profile. No fresh graves. The silence was deafening. Detectives considered the possibilities. Maybe the killer was arrested on another charge. Maybe he moved. Or maybe he was dead. It was an eerie quiet, the kind that comes not from peace, but from unfinished business. By 2010, the digging was done. The victims had names, but the killer remained a ghost. The case grew colder with every passing month, leaving the city haunted, and detectives desperate for a break that never came. But in the shadows of this mystery, a name was about to surface, a man whose life and death would lead investigators closer to the truth. By the spring of 2010, the West Mesa site was quiet again. The police tape was gone. The excavation equipment had rolled away. But beneath the sand, the ghost remained, and above ground, detectives still had no name for the man who put them there. Thousands of hours had been spent on the case. Hundreds of leads followed, and yet there was no suspect officially charged. Until investigators began looking at one man, someone who had lived just miles from the burial ground, a man with a history of violence, and a death that seemed far too coincidental. His name was Montoya. Lorenzo Montoya wasn't new to police. Born in 1971, he grew up in Albuquerque and lived in a small house off Blake Road, a quiet neighborhood southwest of the city, only about 3 miles from the West Mesa gravesite. He worked at a local printing company. Neighbors described him as quiet, reserved, sometimes odd, but behind closed doors, Montoya had a secret life. Since the late 1990s, he'd been arrested multiple times for soliciting sex workers and accused of assaulting women he lured into his car. In one early case, a woman claimed Montoya strangled her with a ligature, but escaped before he could kill her. The charges were eventually dropped when she refused to testify. Police had suspected he was dangerous, but with little evidence, he'd slipped through the system. On the night of December 13, 2006, 3 years before the West Mesa discovery, Montoya's double life came to a sudden, violent end. Around 11:45 p.m., neighbors heard gunshots echo through the dark. When police arrived at Montoya's home, they found 2 bodies in the driveway. Montoya was dead, shot multiple times. The other body belonged to Sherika Hill, a 19-year-old sex worker. She'd been strangled with a cord. Her body was wrapped in a plastic tarp, and police discovered a makeshift rope pulley in Montoya's garage. According to reports, Hill's boyfriend had been waiting outside during her encounter with Montoya. When she didn't return, he entered the property, found Montoya dragging her body, and opened fire. It was over in seconds. When detectives entered the house, what they saw unsettled them. There were videos, ropes, and bindings, signs of control, domination, and violence. Evidence suggested this wasn't the first time, and soon something even darker emerged. When the West Mesa graves were discovered in 2009, investigators cross-referenced every known sex worker homicide or disappearance from that era. Montoya's name stood out. He'd lived nearby. He'd targeted women from the same areas. He'd killed at least one, in exactly the same manner suspected in the Mesa deaths. But what truly caught their attention was the timeline. The last known West Mesa victims disappeared between 2003 and 2005. Montoya was killed in late 2006. After that, no new victims. The murders stopped. To detectives, it was as if someone had flipped a switch. The desert went silent right after Montoya's death. Could that be coincidence? Or had the bone collector been shot dead that night in his own driveway? His crimes buried with him? Detectives began digging into Montoya's past. They examined his vehicles, his work records, his known associates. His pickup truck, which matched witness descriptions from missing persons reports, had been sold shortly before his death. No traceable DNA remained. Phone records placed him frequently near East Central Avenue, the same area where many victims were last seen. He had ties to several of the women, including one who had reportedly been seen at his home before vanishing. Still, despite the mounting circumstantial evidence, there was no direct proof linking Montoya to the West Mesa graves. No DNA, no personal items, no witness who could say they'd seen him in the desert. Without that, prosecutors couldn't officially name him as the killer. But among investigators, opinions were forming. Many believed they had found their man. FBI profilers analyzed the killer's behavior through the burial site's details. The graves were organized in rows, spaced evenly, suggesting the killer was methodical, possibly obsessive, and familiar with routine. He had confidence, revisiting the same site multiple times without fear. He likely had a regular job, access to a vehicle, and knowledge of isolated terrain. When the profile was compared to Montoya, the similarities were uncanny. He lived nearby. He had the right vehicle. He operated in a pattern, and his killings stopped when he died. It was never enough for a conviction, but in the world of behavioral profiling, the match was high probability. Despite the strong case against Montoya, detectives didn't close the door on other theories. One name that surfaced was Fred Reynolds, a local pimp and small-time drug dealer who had connections to several victims. He collected photographs of missing women, supposedly for street flyers, but many questioned his motives. Reynolds died of natural causes in 2009, before police could question him in depth. Another suspect was a man named Joseph Blee, known locally as the Toy Box Man, because of his work as a landscaper, often near schools. Blee was later convicted of unrelated sex crimes and assaults on women. Police found women's jewelry and underwear in his home. When questioned, Blee denied any connection to the West Mesa murders. And yet, his criminal record, proximity, and the items found in his possession made him a persistent person of interest. Even so, without physical evidence from the burial site, The case stalled once again. In one of the earlier attacks linked to Montoya, a survivor came forward. She described being choked and beaten after accepting a ride from a man in a dark car. She escaped by jumping from the moving vehicle. Her description matched Montoya, but at the time, no link was made. Years later, when she saw his photo after the 2006 incident, she recognized him immediately. Her story became one of the most haunting what-ifs of the entire investigation. If Montoya had been stopped then, could the West Mesa victims have been saved? After Montoya's death, his home was cleared, his vehicle sold, and the case closed as self-defense. Police didn't yet know the magnitude of what they'd stumbled across. 3 years later, when the West Mesa discovery made headlines, the timing of his death suddenly seemed too perfect to ignore. Investigators returned to his property, searching the backyard, the crawl spaces, and the garage where Sherika Hill had died. But by then, any remaining trace of his possible crimes was gone. He was dead, his secrets were buried, and the desert had already covered its tracks. In the years following the discovery, online communities and amateur investigators began dissecting the case. Some believed Montoya was a convenient scapegoat, an easy answer to a difficult mystery. Others were convinced he fit the profile too precisely to be coincidence. A few even theorized that more than one killer could have been involved, that the West Mesa site might have been used by multiple predators operating in the same circles. There were whispers of human trafficking, drug debts, and gang retaliation, theories that never gained traction but kept the story alive in the public imagination. Still, amid all the speculation, one truth remained. The women buried on the Mesa were real. Their lives were taken by someone who moved unnoticed through the city for years. By 2015, nearly a decade after the discovery, police quietly acknowledged what many already suspected. The case was officially cold. They continued to receive tips about new suspects, possible accomplices, even sightings of vehicles, but none led to evidence solid enough to reopen the case. DNA testing of all known evidence yielded nothing new. Technology, despite its advancements, couldn't resurrect what time and neglect had erased. For the families, the uncertainty was worse than grief. Some believed justice had already been served, that Montoya's death was a final act of a killer meeting his fate. Others refused to accept it without proof. The truth, buried somewhere between the sand and the silence, remains out of reach. In a city that built itself on the promise of growth, the West Mesa murders were a reminder of what happens when the vulnerable are forgotten. For years, someone preyed on the invisible, and when the earth finally spoke, it told a story no one could unhear. But this story doesn't end with suspects or theories. It ends with memory, and with the people who still fight to keep the victims' names alive. Time has a way of covering things up, just like the wind that sweeps over this mesa every evening, burying old footprints, erasing the signs of what once was. It's been more than 15 years since a woman walking her dog uncovered what the desert had tried to hide. 11 women and 1 unborn child, all laid to rest in shallow graves. The killer was never officially named. The families never received justice. And the city of Albuquerque was left with a wound that never fully healed. But even now, this story isn't over, because in the shadows of loss, echoes remain. When the excavation ended in early 2009, the site was fenced off. A temporary memorial was set up by locals, photos, candles, handmade crosses. For weeks, people came and went, bringing flowers, notes, prayers. In the beginning, there was silence, just disbelief. Then came anger, then grief. Detective Ida Lopez, whose quiet persistence had helped connect the victims, visited the Mesa often. She said she could still feel the weight of their stories there, as if the earth hadn't finished speaking. Every investigator who worked the case described the same sensation. Standing on that barren land, you could almost hear the past whispering, a reminder that justice was still waiting. For the families, the discovery brought both closure and heartbreak. Closure, because the waiting was over. Heartbreak, because the answers stopped there. Julie Nieto's mother, Evelyn Salazar's cousin, Michelle Valdez's sister, they all became the public faces of a private kind of pain. They spoke at city council meetings. They organized vigils. They kept the victims' names in the news when everyone else began to forget. One mother said, "We used to look for our girls. Now we just look for who took them." For them, the West Mesa wasn't a crime scene. It was sacred ground. Years passed. Detectives followed new tips and watched them dry up just as quickly. Every so often, a rumor spread. A confession in prison, a new suspect, a promising DNA result. But none of it led anywhere. The truth is, the killer might have been dead long before police ever arrived. If Lorenzo Montoya was the man responsible, his death in 2006 closed the case before it even began. But detectives never declared it solved. They couldn't, not without evidence. To this day, the West Mesa murders remain officially unsolved. In the aftermath, Albuquerque began to change, slowly, painfully. Community groups formed around the memory of the victims. Former sex workers and addiction survivors began outreach programs for women still living on the streets. The city expanded its resources for missing persons and began using databases more aggressively to connect cases earlier. One organization, founded by families of the West Mesa victims, began handing out flyers with the words, "Every missing woman matters." It wasn't just about the 11. It was about the others who might never be found. Because for every victim recovered from the desert, there were dozens more still missing across New Mexico, names known only to a few who refused to stop searching. Today, the West Mesa site sits under the open sky, its horizon lined with new homes and construction. A city has grown up around it, but the desert underneath hasn't forgotten. Each year, on the anniversary of the discovery, families return to the Mesa. They bring flowers. They speak their daughters' names aloud. They promise never to let them disappear again, not from memory. In 2015, the city of Albuquerque officially dedicated the area as the West Mesa Memorial Park. A simple monument now stands at the site, 11 granite stones arranged in a quiet semicircle, facing the mountains. No dramatic inscription, just names. Because names are all the desert ever gave back. Despite years of investigation, the same haunting questions remain. Why did the killing stop? Why this specific location? Were there accomplices? And how could someone bury 11 people within city limits without being seen? Detectives say the killer knew the land before it was developed, possibly through work in construction or landscaping. He likely visited at night, bringing one body at a time, confident no one would notice. And perhaps most chillingly, investigators believe he may have watched the area develop afterward. Homes, roads, and families slowly surrounding his secret. Over the years, technological advances have given investigators new tools. Forensic genealogy, the same method that caught the Golden State Killer, has been quietly discussed for the West Mesa case. If even a partial DNA trace can be linked to a relative, the killer's identity might still emerge. But funding, privacy laws, and the age of the evidence have slowed progress. As of today, no new results have been released. But detectives still hope that one day, the science will catch up to the mystery. Among the public, The theories haven't stopped. Some still believe Joseph Blee, the convicted rapist, could have been the real killer, citing his pattern of abducting women from the same areas. Others insist Montoya fits too perfectly to ignore. A few believe both men could have been active at the same time, preying on the same vulnerable population. And there are those who think the truth may be something more complex, a network, not a lone killer. But speculation can only go so far. The only person who truly knows what happened is gone. For Albuquerque, the West Mesa case changed how missing persons are handled forever. It forced law enforcement to acknowledge what had been ignored for too long, that vulnerability shouldn't determine visibility. The victims are now taught in criminal justice courses, discussed in forensic seminars, remembered in vigils. Each of their names, Cinnamon Elks, Michelle Valdez, Veronica Romero, Victoria Chavez, and the rest, stand as more than victims. They are the proof that forgotten lives still demand to be seen. Their story is not just about death. It's about how we treat those who fall through society's cracks. It's about the price of silence. As the sun sets over Albuquerque's western horizon, the desert turns gold, then red, then gray. The wind moves softly, brushing over the ground where the graves once were. It's quiet now, but not empty, because in every gust of dust, every shifting shadow, there's an echo of the lives that once passed through here. The West Mesa still holds secrets. Maybe somewhere out there, beneath the sand, lies a clue that could finally reveal who did this, and why. Maybe time hasn't erased everything after all. The women of the West, Mesa, were never supposed to be found, but they were. And because of that, their story became bigger than the person who took them. Maybe that's the only justice left, that in the end, the killer's name will fade. But there's never will. This has been the West Mesa Bone Collector. Thank you for listening and for keeping their memory alive. And if you want to keep exploring the stories that the world tried to forget, subscribe and stay with us. There are still more truths waiting beneath the surface.